Hello, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar, a programme first on the Local Government Association's Housing Advisors Programme. I'm Harry, a policy advisor here at the LGA. Firstly, some housekeeping before we get started. Sorry for that slight delay in getting started. You'll see on your GoToWebinar control panel that you're muted. You'll know from your own meetings that a 5-person teleconference can present some issues, and we have over 70 people dialing in today. To enable you to interact today, you'll also see a question box. If you have any questions, please type them here. I'll bring them up at the midpoint, and we'll also have some time for questions at the end. If you're struggling with this, or if you'd like to ask some more questions after the webinar is over, please send them across to housingadvisors@local.gov.uk. We'll be writing all of these up into an FAQs and putting them on our website after the webinar is over. We're also recording today's session, and you'll be sent the recording after the webinar is over. It will also be uploaded to the LGA's website. We'll also be sending over you a short bonus recording of another project team, Cambridge District Council and Three Dragons Consultancy. They're going to be talking through their experiences on the programme and what their most important learning has been. Without further ado, let's move on to our main session. We're joined today by a Housing Advisors Programme funded project team. Firstly, we have Graham Smith, who is Head of Planning, Policy and Economic Development from Test Valley Borough Council. And we're also joined by Sarah Zilmer-Mode, who is Director at Cities Mode Planning Consultancy.
Hello.
And we're also joined by Jamie McKee, a Senior Associate in Planning and Public Law at Dentons.
Hi there, great to be here.
And finally, the chair for today is Priya Sethi, Homelessness Policy Advisor here at the LGA.
Hi everyone, and thank you, Harry, for the introduction. So I'll take you through the webinar content. Today we're going to provide you with a brief introduction to the programme. We'll be hearing from Sarah, Graham and Jamie, the Test Valley project team, on their experience of the Housing Advisors Programme. And we'll give you some tips on applying for the 2019-20 programme. As Harry said, if you've got any questions, please do type them into the questions box at any point, and we'll bring them up halfway through the webinar and again at the end. So, an introduction to the Housing Advisors Programme. It's been running for 2 years and we're now entering our 3rd year. And the aim of the programme from the LGA's perspective is really to support councils to address what we know is a significant nationwide housing crisis. It is nationwide, but we also know that housing markets are complex and varied, and that there are many issues which are really quite local and unique to specific authorities. We also know that it's local government that's the heart of the solution. So councils are house builders, they're planners, and they're legally responsible for tackling homelessness. And so we know that solutions to a housing crisis need to be local too. Now, over the last few years, we've seen a lot of innovation coming out of local government around housing. And we wanted to see if we could enable this by really enhancing councils' capacity to tackle some of those tricky local issues. So this is why we launched the Housing Advisors Programme, where we fund councils to work with expert advisors on a local housing project of their own choosing. We've seen really a lot of fantastic work happen over the last 2 years. We funded over 100 councils to help build homes, to plan for massive demographic changes in their areas, to realign their homelessness strategies, and more. And I have to say, this really doesn't capture the massive diversity of projects that we funded over the last couple of years. And this year, as in previous years, we really are aiming to be simple and flexible and led by you locally. However, we want to build on the success of the last couple of years and really ramp up the programme's impact on tackling the housing crisis. We also wanted to make sure that the projects we fund are building capacity in councils so that you have the tools you need to make your project sustainable in the longer term beyond the life of the programme. So this is why we've made a change this year, and we will now be funding projects for up to £50,000 each instead of the £14,000 to £28,000 allocations in previous years. And what this means is that councils will be able to work with their chosen advisor for much, much longer to we hope, really improve outcomes in their local area. What this might look like is entirely up to you. We want the programme to help you transform how you meet a local housing need. And this might involve, for example, bringing together partners to refresh homelessness services and focus on prevention. It might involve reforming the entire end-to-end planning process and your council's relationship with developers. Or it might be thinking about how we can enable your council to improve the quality of its housing. So it's entirely up to you, but our only ask is that you can show us how this project meets your local need, and that you can show us that it will be relevant to a broader group of councils than just your own, and it will have an impact beyond the life of the funding, so beyond that 1 year period of the programme. We've asked you to set some of this out in your expressions of interest, and we'll be talking about that in a bit more detail later. Obviously, this new approach does mean that we'll be funding for your projects. However, we hope that that doesn't mean that the programme's benefit will be limited to the councils which are awarded funding, because also new this year is a learning programme, which will support funded councils to have an active role in creating learning and sharing learning about what has worked for them and their projects. Again, there'll be more details about this later in the webinar, and we hope that this will enable the whole sector to make use of the housing advisors' expertise and funded councils' experience in some way, shape or form. So with that, we are now going to introduce our speakers who will give us a little bit of background on their position and how they've been involved with the Housing Advisors Programme. So firstly, Graham, can you tell us a bit about yourself, please?
Yeah, of course. Hello, everyone. My name is Graham Smith. I'm the Head of Planning Policy and Economic Development of Test Valley Borough Council. Test Valley is a relatively small rural borough on the western edge of Hampshire, and we successfully bid for the full £28,000 grant as part of the 17-18 Housing Advisory Programme.
Great, thank you, Graham. Sarah?
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm a Chartered Town Planner and I'm Director of Cities Mode Planning. We work with local authorities across the country to develop local plans and also on strategies that support the implementation and delivery of those local plans. We're also increasingly involved in research projects that support best practice in planning.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And last but not least, Jamie.
Hi everyone, my name is Jamie Mackay. I'm a planning solicitor at Dentons, and I act for both local authorities and private developers, so I understand both perspectives when it comes to development. I've also worked with Sarah in the past, and I became involved in this particular project really with a view to just bringing a lawyer's perspective to the issues that were being experienced with the site. In particular, I looked at the extent to which the council might be able to force a developer's hand by exploring acquisition of the site using its CPO powers.
All right, thank you so much, everyone, and it's really great to have you here. So let's get stuck into talking about the work you've done at Test Valley. Graham, would you mind starting by telling us a little bit about your Housing Advisors funded project?
Yeah, of course. I'll give you a little bit of context first about the site and the location. So Romsey is a market town, a historic market town at the southern end of the borough, about 7 miles north of Southampton. Relatively small market town, 20,000 population, and what we have in the centre of the town is a derelict Romsey brewery site. It's about 3 hectares in total, right in the centre of the town. The site has got a long and complex planning history, including a series of planning applications, planning appeals. It's been allocated for housing in both the 1996 and the 2006 local plans. So a lot of history around the site. And what we wanted to do is just trying to bring that site forward for residential. There are 2 key planning permissions relating to the site. The first relates to a listed building, the old Malt House, which permission was granted back in December 1998 for 44 flats, and they've been completed in the year 2006, 2007. But the critical bit is the second permission, and that relates to the rest of the site, rest of the derelict site. And that was granted in the summer of 2006, and the permission related to 211 dwellings, in addition to the Malt House, made up of 172 open markets and the residual, the 39, being affordable. But since that initial permission back in August 2006, we've only seen 13 open market houses built out on that site, and we haven't had any completions since the 2013-14 financial year. So there's a lot of frustration from the council, from the councillors, and from the members of the community about this derelict site being left fallow in the middle of the town and no progress being made, especially as we've been bringing forward the reviews of the local plan and looking to allocate additional greenfield sites around Romsey. So you get that complex situation of members of the public, the community, and other organisations, and your own members not understanding why greenfield sites have to come forward at the expense of this brownfield site not moving. So we were getting criticised as officers for not exploring all the avenues that could be available to us, and just explaining what avenues there were, so people could understand why things weren't moving. So one of the requests from our initial bid was just to sort of seek that expert support to provide guidance on bringing forward delivery of the sites, what tools could be used by the council, and with a specific focus on sort of compulsory purchase order method. The actual site itself is, whilst nothing's happened on site, there's been recent planning applications on viability grounds, and that has increased the sort of complexity around the site.
Okay, thank you, Graham. So that gives us, I think, a really clear sense of why Test Valley chose to put forward an application around planning support in the Housing Advisors Programme. So a really clear picture of that local need. Thank you. So my next question is for Sarah and Jamie. So as advisors, how did you approach Test Valley's project, kind of working as part of a team together and with Test Valley themselves? What did you do?
Well, our starting point really starts where Graham's already started, which was to understand the site and its context. So really to get to grips with the spatial context and the history of the site. So we kicked off the project with a meeting with Graham and his colleagues at the council. We were really keen to tap into the authority's understanding of the site, and in particular to better understand the relationship and the nature of the engagement that the authority had had with the developer. But to make the most of this meeting, we wanted to come informed, so we did some initial research and investigation. And we started really at our desk with a very detailed review of the planning history, quite a complex planning history that Graham has outlined. So looking at those past applications on the site, including appeal decisions. This was followed by a more detailed analysis of the actual permission that's being implemented that Graham referred to in his introduction to the site, with a particular focus on looking at the planning conditions and the Section 106 legal agreement associated with that permission. And we were looking really for any issues that might have impacted on the delivery of the site, so i.e. the build-out rate that we're seeing on the site there. We also stepped back a bit, looking at this bigger picture, and looked at the development plan policies that were in place, both at the time of the permission, but also looking at those policies since then. As Graham mentioned, the authority were bringing forward their new local plan. And this understanding in this policy context was, we had one eye on recommendations for actions, which would be in the context of the current spatial strategy, rather than a roll forward of those spatial strategies that were in effect at the time that the permission was granted. Our next thing was to get out on site. We got out on site and did a site visit, and this meant looking at the site itself, but also the wider spatial context. We wanted to see what was next to the site, what were the development sites immediately adjacent, looking at access routes and the overall setting within the area. And again, this would help us understand the current position, but also would, of course, be relevant to any actions that we subsequently recommended to the Council. So this initial research helps us to understand a bit more, but also usefully helps us clarify some very specific technical issues at our meeting with the Council, and to focus more in that case on understanding how the authority had engaged with the site developer and the actions that they had taken or considered in the past. We were then able to furnish Jamie's team with this initial research and the specific updates from Graham and the team at the Council to help us develop recommendations for action.
That's great. Thank you so much, Sarah. And Jamie, did Dentons adopt a similar approach to the one outlined by Cities Mode?
Well, we did essentially. We were able to build on the work that Sarah and Graham had done in terms of setting out the background, the wider site analysis and the policy. So we were sort of left with the foundations, and what our role was to do then was to sort of go forward and look at what particular legal tools might be available to Test Valley to help unlock this particular site. And as everybody knows, the constant churn of planning regulations and policy changes can be pretty wearing, but what they mean is that there's actually a lot more tools in the LPA's toolbox now than they've ever had before. So our role was to sort of look at what tools there might be, one of which was the CPO, which has always been there, but has changed a bit and has become a bit easier to use over the last couple of years. But we were looking at getting sort of anything we could get for the LPA to drive forward discussions with the landowner and try and unlock what was a stalled site.
That's great, thank you. And I mean, off the back of all of this work, what advice or recommendations did you end up submitting to Test Valley to Graham and his team?
Well, we set out a whole series of actions for the authority, including the analysis of the potential CPO. Jamie's already mentioned CPO, but CPO is, of course, not the starting point. It can't be. A series of short-term actions were identified. Firstly, as I mentioned, we looked very closely at the permission to identify any issues that might have been inhibiting the build-out of the scheme. And to be honest, though, we didn't identify any obvious problems that would have inhibited development, but we did highlight a few issues that the local authority might want to revisit and review, and that was included in our recommendation. And this included matters on which more robust or detailed evidence might be required or needed from the developer than had been submitted to date, particularly around site viability. We also recommended that the authority invite the developer of the site for a meeting and consider more direct and regular schedule of communication on those site issues. And we suggested exploring that in the context of the appeal that Graham mentioned again at the top, which was against a refusal to vary affordable housing, and to explore there whether there was an opportunity to negotiate a mutually acceptable approach. We also suggested that in parallel, the authority effectively continue to gather evidence and clarify land ownership issues, again with one eye on those sort of legal tools that Jamie mentioned. But we also took a step back again and looked at that site more broadly, to kind of thinking about that site in the context of the place and the wider emerging strategy that Graham and his team were developing and pushing forward at the time. And we highlighted the possibility of engaging with the developer and the community on the site's future and building a vision and perhaps new policy context for a revised application. Perhaps an overly optimistic recommendation given the timetable to that of the site build out, but absolutely still worth consideration based on the site's characteristics as outlined by Graham and in that as a emerging and changing policy context. Linked to this, we also suggested exploring a sort of halfway house option with the authority or a housing association, partnering with the developer in some way to take forward delivery. The longer term actions we recommended primarily centred on legal tools, which is where Jamie and his team came in.
Thanks, Sarah. So yeah, we were asked to look particularly at whether the use of CPO powers here would be appropriate to unlock the site. And as Sarah mentioned, CPO isn't the starting point, but it's something that you build a case for if that's where you feel you need to go. So our advice looked at the legislative framework for CPO, what steps needed to be taken and what process needed to be followed. It's a very procedural beast. And it was clear to us from the work so far that the council had tentatively explored this and had been engaged with the developer, but not necessarily with a view to building a case for a CPO in the future, but more just to understand what was going on the site and what the problems were. So it was clear to us that some further work needed to be done to build a case for using CPO powers. And in our view, the work needed to address several issues which were key to help understand better what relevant matters there were on the site. And those included potential funding, dealing with viability challenges. As mentioned earlier on, that there was an appeal to try and trim down the affordable housing requirements on the site, which is something that happens quite a bit in practice. But really sort of understanding what those viability issues were, whether they were genuine and how they manifested themselves and what effect they had on delivery. And then also identifying, most importantly, the public benefits that would flow from any CPO. We'd need to show that it's in the public's interest to actually acquire the site. And then if we did that, how would the council take it forward? Would it develop itself? Could it build out the units itself as starting up its own build company, as quite a few councils are doing? Or would they do it alone or in partnership? Or might they explore an alternative planning consent on the site? And I referred earlier to the toolbox, and we have now the brownfield register. This is a brownfield site. We also have planning permission in principle as an alternative way to package up that land with a residential consent, which might work, because we were conscious that the consent that was granted several years ago wasn't necessarily one that would be granted in today's climate, so we might want to revisit that. And we also looked, as Sarah mentioned earlier on, at the sort of the basic stuff on the site. So what are the planning conditions attached to the operative planning consent, and how are the obligations framed? Is there any wriggle room in the Section 106 agreement for sort of forcing the developer's hand a bit? What can we do around those conditions and obligations?
Thank you both. So it sounds like a lot of really detailed work went on, really rooted in that local context. And Graham, what happened next? Were you able to progress any of this advice?
Yeah, we were. So I think it's interesting to sort of point out that the recommendations that came from the study not only helped the authority with its local planning authority role, but also just helped with that hearts and minds of public relations, and just demonstrating that the council were being more proactive than it previously has been in trying to investigate delivery on this site. So just doing the Housing Advisors Programme was a benefit. Getting the advice from the experts in their field helped to demonstrate that, and that sort of fresh approach was just a really sort of powerful for our councillors and the community. Yes, we explored each of the recommendations. We've acted on those, and we've ticked some of those off, so they've been completed. But as the others have alluded to, the appeal at the time dealing with viability made some of the recommendations. We had to put them on ice slightly. That's not to say that we're not going to do them, but it's sort of once where the viability and the discussions have continued and have perhaps been exhausted, we'll revisit the CPO and the other elements that Jamie mentioned. But certainly just having the programme as a springboard to have that conversation with the developer and perhaps a different, less confrontational arena was a refreshing start.
That's great. Thank you, Graham. So it sounds like, tentatively, we could say some quite positive outcomes have been achieved as a result of the project, both in the short and the long term, which is obviously brilliant from our perspective. My next question, I suppose for everyone, is would you say there's been any transferable learning for other councils in terms of, how you work together and what came out of the project itself? So Jamie, if we could start with you.
Yeah, I think we've mentioned earlier that this site is quite unusual and has very specific challenges. But I don't think that stops some of the key themes from being equally applicable to other sites and to the council's approach to development more generally. I mean, the two obvious ones are the use of CPO powers. Some councils are becoming a bit more aggressive and using those sometimes as a threat to push conversations forward, and other times a bit more genuine in actually pursuing those. And the expertise is being built up to do that. So CPO learning is applicable, I think, to every local authority out there that is having issues in assembling land and getting homes built, which obviously is a major priority now with the housing delivery test and the stick that the government is using to beat local authorities over the heads with to ensure that homes get delivered. And the other big one, the main theme, is understanding viability constraints, which again are increasingly used, or sometimes used, not necessarily increasingly, but sometimes used by developers to push back on affordable housing requirements. And there are different approaches being taken in London with the Mayor's SPG as against some other local authorities which have different challenges, but viability issues on sites often do come into the mix during the planning stage, and it's a very expert area, and it's not one that necessarily planners are geared up to deal with from day one. So it can be a murky world, it can be a dark art, and we tend to get lots of consultants getting involved in these things. But understanding the viability of a site is often the starting point in understanding what it can sensibly deliver. And you know, that's learning that applies to everybody, I think. And one other thing is worth mentioning here, I think there's a link on the slides. We ran a delivery challenge event, which was a sort of a loose example, not specifically referencing Test Valley, but using similar facts, where we got some experts in the room to just talk through how they might deal with these types of issues on sites. And what we've done is we hosted this on our Planning TV platform on the Dentons website, the planning blog, and we've got a link on our slides there, I think, for anyone who's interested in having a look at that.
That's great. Thank you, Jamie. And Sarah?
In terms of that transferable learning, I'd absolutely agree with what Jamie has said. The process we went through, investigating the site, the analysis of the permission, looking at those conditions in the Section 106 agreement, and then recommendations around the programme of engagement and partnership working, and if necessary, ramping up to legal action, including CPA, is a framework that could be applied in any context, really, with similar site delivery issues. But as Jamie and Graham have really indicated, the realities are often more nuanced and complex. This site was an interesting one. You had proactive authority officers and no obvious showstoppers like sort of unknown abnormal cost or proven viability issues, and certainly at the time of the investigation. So this is what prompted Jamie and I really to think about doing that delivery challenge event, which was, as Jamie mentioned, effectively giving a more general stall site scenario to sector experts, including the planning advisory services, Anna Rose, and other development experts, to generate creative responses to getting these types of stalled sites built out.
That's brilliant. Thank you, everyone. So it sounds like the learning from this project is spreading, and thank you for coming to share it with us today. And really just taking the time to talk about your project. I found it really interesting, and I hope all of the councils listening in did too. And for everyone listening, if you are working on a similar challenge, or indeed a challenge around another area of housing, you can find out more about what Graham, Sarah and Jamie did on the case study section of our website, along with lots of other case studies from the Housing Advisor Programme. So with that, I'm going to open this up to questions for the Test Valley team.
Thank you, everyone. So we're going to go ahead and take some questions now. Just a reminder, please be sure to type your questions into the question box in your control panel. This is the first opportunity for questions. We've also got some time allocated at the end for more specific ones about potential applications. So firstly, a question for you, Graham. How involved would you say your elected members were in your Housing Advisors Programme project? Do you have any advice for listening councils on how to secure senior buy-in?
Oh, I think it's absolutely critical that you've got senior member and also senior officer buy-in to any submission you make to the programme. My portfolio holder is also the deputy leader. He was fully on board with the submission, really supported it, really used it in that sort of positive PR piece on behalf of the council to the local press, the local social media, just to demonstrate how things were moving on. And it was helpful because it coincided with the council coming out of a hangover period of 5-year housing land supply appeals. So it just sort of demonstrated what the council was trying to do to move things forward with priming that housing growth that Jamie and Sarah have already mentioned. So it's absolutely critical to get that senior member and senior officer sign off and buy into the process. It raises the prestige of it and raises the profile of the council in doing such a submission. So I think the question is, why wouldn't you get that buy-in?
Thanks, Graham. That was really great. We've now got a question from James Harrison from Coventry City Council. So this is probably best for you, Priya. It sounds like the Housing Advisors Programme can fund different advisors with different skills on a single project. Is that the case?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, so we're making a bit of a change to the process this year in that we are handing over the reins to you, the councils, to decide how you want to work with your suppliers and to lead on the procurement of those suppliers. We'll be helping you by putting you in touch with suppliers who've worked with us previously, but really, if you think that your project would be best served by a range of advisors with a range of skills, then that is absolutely something that is within your control to put together as a team.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And just on the Test Valley project, obviously there you had 2 different advisors. Graham, would you say that it was beneficial that you had both Cities Mode and Dentons?
Well, I think the sort of the advice that we were seeking, it certainly needed that 2-pronged of professional advice, both Sarah from the planning side and Jamie from the more legal interpretation. So yes, it was definitely helpful. Their joint submission or joint sort of bid was a definite benefit for us.
Okay, so thank you again. It seems like that's all the questions that we have for the Test Valley team, but if anyone has any more questions, as we said earlier, please do send them over to the Housing Advisors inbox and we'll make sure that the team gets them. Thank you so much again, Graham, Sarah and Jamie, for taking the time and being with us here today. With that, I'm going to move on to the next section of the webinar, which is talking about how to apply for the programme. I'll run through the assessment process, what we're looking for in our applications, and what happens if your application isn't successful. Right, the first thing is for your council to submit a written expression of interest by 5 p.m. on the 19th of September. It's really short, really simple, and it's the main way in which we'll be assessing your applications. If you want an EOI form, just shoot an email over to housingadvisors@local.gov.uk. You'll hopefully have seen from our prospectus that there are a few mandatory criteria before you even start filling out that EOI. So first, you'll need to demonstrate buy-in from either your leader and chief exec or appropriate lead member and senior officer. As Graham said, getting that senior buy-in is super important. And in that list, we need your Section 151 officer if they aren't kind of one of the senior officers in that list. You'll also need to show us that you're committed to the project for its duration. So have a think about whether you have the officer capacity that you need for your project to succeed, even as it gets into the later months, and making sure you have the capacity to participate in that sharing of learning with other councils. Okay, so then for the main body of the expression of interest, we're asking you to go through 7 questions. Be super concise. You don't need to give us more than 500 words per question. Really, that old cliche, quality over quantity. So the first question is, what is the project for which you're seeking support and why is it important for your area? Now, here we really want to understand what is the local housing need which your project is trying to address, who is it impacting and how is it impacting that set of people. Try not to give us an overview of the national issue. Instead, tell us why this matters to you locally. That's what we really want to know. And then about the project. Why does this project meet that local need? How do you know, or why do you think it will meet that local need? What evidence did you use in putting together your project proposal? And don't just stop at outlining the local problem. Give us a sense of how it might be solved and how your project will help solve that problem. And finally, really importantly under this question, we want to get a sense of, is that project achievable and is it manageable? So the second question we're going to need to answer is, how much funding are you seeking from the Housing Advisors Programme to secure expert advice for the project? Here, obviously you won't necessarily have all of the details up front, but we are looking for a sensible costing, a clear and where possible detailed cost plan of what you'll be spending on which elements of the project and when. Obviously the funding is to secure expert advice, so what we're really asking here is, how many days of support or advice will you need for each element of your project? Think about it in terms of days. Thirdly, we're asking, in what areas do you need support and how can the Housing Advisors Programme add value to what you're thinking of doing locally? So this question is really about additionality. What have you already done and what will the extra support help you with? And we really want to get a sense of what impact the project would have, which you wouldn't have been able to achieve without this additional support from the advisors. The fourth question is, what are the anticipated timescales, milestones, and key outputs for the project? Essentially here we're looking for a project plan, so something which helps your project's delivery board, which does include the LGA, understand what's on track and what isn't. It would also be good to get a sense of what you're hoping to produce at each stage in terms of output and what the main output will be at the end. So are you thinking that your advisor will produce a report or a business case or perhaps a new strategy? Question 5 is, what will success look like? How will you measure the outcomes? So we're asking, what will be the outcomes from your project? What is it that you want to achieve? What is it you want to have changed? And how can we measure whether you've achieved this change? So, for example, if you're hoping that your council will save money on some aspect of delivery, which aspect of delivery and how much money? Question 6 is, how will the project have a sustained impact beyond the period of funding? So what do you think will be the longer term impact of the project? And also, what do you think is the potential for impact on other councils or learning for other councils? And how do you think you'll achieve this? So once your time with your advisor has ended, what work will you within the council need to do to make sure that this longer term and broader impact is taking effect? And how will the learning from your approach be transferable to other councils? I think that is covered by the previous point. So I would suggest thinking for question 6, how will the project have a sustained impact beyond the period of funding? I think that's about longer term impact and your contribution beyond the life of the project. Question 7, how will the learning from your approach be transferable to other councils? That's about what is the impact on other local authorities. And, what could you do to contribute to our learning programme, which we'll talk about in more detail later. If you think you might need help with any of the above questions, please do get in touch on housingadvisors@local.gov.uk. We are, as always, really happy to talk through your project. We have also this year really kindly been offered the support of the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence, which is a consortium of 14 organisations, including academics and housing policy and practice experts. They are brilliant and they're happy to help with guiding you towards evidence that could help to inform your project proposal. They could also help you talk through any other aspect of the learning and evidence side of your project. I'd really encourage you to take them up on this offer. And just please shoot an email to garethyoung@sheffield.ac.uk. That's gareth.young@sheffield.ac.uk, who is our point of contact at the UK Collaborative Centre. So, next, you have submitted your expressions of interest, and at that point we'll be putting it through 2 sifts. One is a broader sift looking at how well you've answered the expression of interest questions, and this will be done by LGA Housing Policy Advisors. We'll then be passing shortlisted applications over to a panel of LGA officers with significant background, significant expertise in housing policy and improvement. Again, they'll be using the expression of interest as their main means of assessing the applications, but at this stage they might want to engage with project teams a bit more on a case-by-case basis if they need a little bit of clarification around anything in your EOI. This year, as we said earlier, we're funding a small number of projects up to £50,000 each. Although you aren't bound to applying for £50,000, you might want to apply for less funding if that's what you feel you need. But if your project hasn't been successful, and we really want to stress this, this isn't the end. The LGA has a really broad improvement offer, which I imagine a lot of you have come into contact with in some way, shape or form. And if we think it's appropriate, we might signpost you to another aspect of that improvement offer or training that we offer, such as masterclasses or the LGA Peer Challenge. Some examples of other programs we run are those run by One Public Estate, the Behavioural Insights program, the Design in the Public Sector program, the LGA Peer Challenge. We also work with the Planning Advisory Service, with local partnerships, and with the Housing Finance Institute. And all of these have relevant support offers that might be better suited to your project, that might help you to really get what you need out of working with the LGA over and above involvement with the Housing Advisors program. We might also have a think about whether we, through the Housing Advisors program, can support your project, but maybe as part of a coalition with other local authorities where there's commonality or where there are relevant themes shared. And finally, the thing to stress is that we're working really hard to share the learning from the program, both in previous years and this year, and you can access the case studies from previous years' projects on our website. This year we'll be running a learning program where we'll be sharing a bit of guidance, we'll be sharing more case studies, and we'll be running events. And that program will be open to all councils, whether you're on the program or not. So our very first peer learning event is coming up really soon on Wednesday, the 16th of October, and it's here at the LGA's office in Westminster in London. And what we really want is for this event to be an opportunity to start to embed the learning from existing housing advisors projects over the last couple of years. On the day, you'll have a chance to hear from more councils and more suppliers that have taken part in the programme, who will be sharing their experiences of tackling their local needs through the programme. But it'll also be a really, really interactive day and a really good opportunity to network with other colleagues from local authorities. Our aim is for everyone who's come, whether they were awarded funding or not, to find the day really, really interesting, really valuable. You can sign up to this event through the LGA's website for free, and the link is on the slide there. You can also find it on our website. Okay, that is all from me. I'll pass back over to Harry.
Thanks, Priya. We're now going to go to our main questions section. So thank you for everyone that has emailed in or has asked questions via the GoToWebinar software. Please do continue to do that. So our first question for you, Priya, would be, can I, as a local authority, submit an application for something we're already doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the most important thing is to show us how the Housing Advisors Programme support is adding value to what you're already doing. So, for example, is there an existing project that you're looking at in your local authority where there's something stuck and where you really need that extra capacity to kind of unlock it or move it forward? If you can show us that additionality, then yeah, absolutely, we are happy to kind of help push forward something that is already happening in your council.
Thanks. Just a question on the assessment criteria. So what would happen if I do not have specific evidence that something is a problem, but I want to use an advisor through the Housing Advisors Programme to help me gather that evidence?
That's a really good question. And I have to say that's a really legitimate aim for a project. So a lot of the projects we've funded in the past have focused on something like this. So understanding the local housing market, understanding, your population and what their needs are, and, understanding what options are available for delivering new homes, as we've heard from the Test Valley team today. So I think there is a really legitimate role for you to use housing advisor support to do a bit of scoping, a bit of evidence gathering. But I would say that even here there needs to be some form of evidence. And what we mean by that is we would want to understand, taking Test Valley as an example, why is delivering new homes so important for your council to meet your local needs? How do you know that this is where advisor time would best be focused to help people in your local authority?
Okay, so another question that we've received is asking, can I submit an application jointly with other councils?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So we funded several collaborative efforts last year where there were similar issues locally, and also where it seemed like a joint solution would have added value, so where that consortium could really do more than one council could by themselves.
Thanks. So we've now got a question from Jen from Wigan Borough Council. So if we're successful in receiving funding from the Housing Advisors Programme, how do you have to spend the money, and is there a time limit on spend?
Okay, I mean, so in terms of what you spend the money on, we are funding you to procure an advisor. So you would, I suppose, spend that money up front in commissioning that advisor's time, and you would, through your expression of interest, put forward a project plan which talks about kind of how you would use that advisor's time and at what stage. We're quite keen for projects to wrap up by the 31st of July 2020, but obviously this is subject to kind of local circumstance. And as we said before, you know, the project that you want to work on, that's absolutely determined by your local circumstance and your local need.
Another question from Jen asks, when will I find out whether I've been successful?
By Friday, the 4th of October. That's an easy one. Thanks, Harry.
We've got a question from Graham Demax, who asks, if you've had an LGA advisor on a previous iteration of the Housing Advisors Programme, will that be a disadvantage in applying this round?
Is that, so if you're a council who's previously been funded through the programme?
Exactly, on a previous year.
No, I mean, it's a competitive process, obviously, and in all of the years we've run this programme, kind of demand has vastly outstripped the amount of funding that we have. But if you can show that your programme is well thought through and that it meets that local need, then there is no reason why we wouldn't fund you again.
Got a question here from Joe West from Buckinghamshire County Council, who asks, can the funding be used to fund preparatory surveys, or is it simply only for planning advice?
It is for whatever you want your advisor to work on, so wherever you think their time and expertise will be best placed. And some of that might be a bit of scoping, a bit of understanding the local landscape. I want to stress that the Housing Advisors Programme, it covers all aspects of housing work. So we have funded projects to do with planning, but we've also funded projects to do with housing delivery, with strategizing, with homelessness, with partnership working, with thinking about how to revitalise temporary accommodation, housing quality. So it's absolutely not limited to planning issues.
Thank you. One more question we've received is, do you receive all the funding in one lump sum, or will it be a number of small sums over a period of time?
The funding is for you to procure an advisor, so you'd receive it in a lump sum.
And so, just one last question. Could you separate three separate local authorities working on a collaborative project all make individual applications if focused on different areas?
So if there are three local authorities who are already engaged in some sort of partnership, they would be welcome to apply for funding to progress that particular partnership or the work that they're carrying out through that partnership, or equally they can each individually, if they want, submit an application for funding on work that is of particular interest to their local authority and their local authority only. So, you know, there's flexibility around that.
Thanks, Priya. Unfortunately, we've now run out of time to answer questions. What we will do is we're going to take a note of all the questions we've received, and we'll write these up into an FAQs, which we'll publish on the Housing Advisors Programme section of the website.
Thank you, Harry. Okay, well, that's all from us, except to say, really hope you enjoyed the webinar, and we're really looking forward to the programme this year and seeing all of your expressions of interest.
Thank you, everyone. We really appreciate you being here, and we hope you found this helpful. Just a reminder that the deadline for HAP applications is Thursday, the 19th of September, and to receive a Housing Advisors Programme expression of interest form, please email housingadvisors@local.gov.uk. Thank you.